Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. Here are some discounts and promos for HPO sponsors. Just a reminder, I have a full breakdown of how I use these products at the end of the episode. So if you're interested in more details, you can check out the end of the episode details as well as heading over to the websites. S Fuels, if you're interested in a right fuel at right time approach, check out their second generation products that just launched. You can get 15% discount by heading to their site. Also, if you want to try a free sample pack for the cost of shipping, there is a link in the show notes and the episode landing page for that. Otherwise, head over to sfuelsgolonger.com. John G Apparel has 10% off with promo code BITTER10. They make some awesome training apparel. And also, don't forget to check out their new multi-pass mini and sling bags. They are great. I use them both. Element Electrolytes has a free sample pack and satisfactory guarantee. If you don't like it, you can get your money back, no questions asked. Don't have to return the product. And that free sample pack you get with a purchase of some of their core lineup. Also, they have a new product, which is called Element Sparkle. It is a 16-ounce carbonated can with the Element Electrolytes mixed in. This one is great. I would definitely suggest checking it out. I've been using it these last few long runs. Delta G Ketones has 20% off with code BITTER20 and also offer free consultations to help you assess how their products might work well in your lifestyle. You can head over to deltagketones.com to access both of those. Here are some discounts and promos for the HPO sponsors. I also have a full breakdown of how I use these products at the end of the episode. So if you want to check that out, head to the end of the podcast episode or wait until the end. Here are some discounts and promos for HPO sponsors. Also, just a reminder, I have a full breakdown of how I use each of these products at the end of the episode. So stick around to hear that if interested. Otherwise, head over to the websites. S Fuels, if you're interested in right fuel at right time approach, check out their second generation products that just launched. You can get a 15% discount by heading to their site. Also, if you want to try a free sample pack for the cost of shipping, there is a link in the show notes and on the episode landing page that will get you access to that. Otherwise, head over to sfuelsgolonger.com. John G Apparel has 10% off with promo code BITTER10. John G makes some great training apparel. I use it in the gym and on runs. You also have a really cool product I've been using a lot lately, which is their multi-pass mini and sling bag. I would definitely recommend checking those out. Element Electrolytes has a free sample pack with a purchase of their core product and a satisfaction guarantee, which just means if you don't like it, you get your money back, no questions asked. You don't even have to return the product. They also just launched a new product called Sparkle, which is a 16-ounce carbonated can with the Element flavors in it. This one's great. I've been using it in my long runs recently. Delta G Ketones has 20% off with promo code BITTER20, and they also offer a free consultation to help you better understand how their product would maybe fit your lifestyle and figure out what protocol would be best with that. So head over to deltagketones.com to check out their products and access that discount. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast. I'm your host, Zach Bitter, and I want to welcome everyone to this episode of the show. As a way to thank the listeners for helping me grow this podcast over the years, I'm going to continue a raffle option for all of you to have a chance to win a free consultation with me. So it's a 30-minute consultation that I will raffle off once per month. All you have to do to enter is share the episodes that you enjoy on whatever platform you find most interesting. The only thing I ask you to do is, if it's a social media channel, make sure you tag me so I see it and can save that and enter in the raffle. Or if it's somewhere else that you can't tag me at, take a screenshot and send that to me at hpopodcast@gmail.com. You can also enter the raffle by writing a show review on your favorite podcast listening platform. So if you do that, take the screenshot, send it to hpopodcast@gmail.com, and I will enter you in that monthly raffle. Also, I'm excited to announce that I launched a new group coaching option. So, to go along with my personalized one on one coaching options and my pre made plans that I have on my website at zachbitter.com, this year I'm starting a group of online endurance runners who want to work with me in a slightly different model. So, this model is set up so that whether you're a beginner or advanced, you can join. Whether you're training for something like a 5K or something as far as a 200 plus miler, you are welcome, and this setup will help you reach your goals. The way I have it set up is if you subscribe, you will have access to my full catalog of training plans, which range from beginner 5K all the way up to advanced 200 plus miles. Along with that plan that you're going to use, you will have access to a weekly group meeting where you can ask questions about training. You can ask about adjustments to the plan to make it more personalized to you. You can engage with the other group members if you want. We'll get you all set up and ready to really personalize that plan to make sure that you're heading in the right direction for your event. Also, you will have access to office hours where if you have something you want to ask and you want to just hop in and ask a question, you'll be given access to that as well. I will be bringing in guest speakers who have a deep understanding of specific topics and things that we'll use to better your training and recovery process throughout the course of the year, as well as a private forum for all the members to engage with one another, share stories, share training tips, and just house a lot of the information that we'll go over on the daily and weekly basis as you're pursuing your race goals. So if you're interested in checking that out, just head to my website at zachbitter.com, go to the coaching tab. From there, you'll be directed to the team coaching option, and you can sign up for that and get onboarded to join the group. If you're interested in keeping up with what I'm up to, please give me a follow on some of my socials. Follow me on Instagram at ZachBitter, on X, Twitter at ZBitter, and check out the brand new HPO podcast handles, which are just at HPO Podcast on Instagram and X/Twitter. Of course, all this stuff can be found quite easily on my website, which is the main landing page for everything I do at zachbitter.com. Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. Well, I mean, I appreciate you taking some time to chat. I always find it interesting the way like guests just come across my purview, and I feel like I should have seen your stuff more recently actually, but one of my coaching clients, Mark, had put me in touch with you and showed me some of the stuff that you were doing, and it seemed like it'd be a great conversation. So I'm excited to have you on to chat for a little bit.
Super. Well, I'm very excited to talk with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I mean, maybe to start, it would be fun just to kind of go over a little bit about tell me if I'm pronouncing this right, the Feldenkrais practitioner side of things that you do.
Sure. And, I was just thinking about this just before we connected here and thinking he's going to ask me about the Feldenkrais method. I hate it when people ask me about the Feldenkrais method, and here's why. I love the Feldenkrais method, and it gives me a tool that is truly unique in this field. Trying to expand the range of people who have this tool to use, but it lets me do things that a coach or physiotherapist or strength and conditioning person or whatever can't do.
Hmm.
But because it has somehow gotten categorized as a holistic type thing, I get a lot of pushback always, and a lot of people saying, "But this is just a cult. This is not
Okay,
science
yeah,
based, And if you Google it, like Wikipedia comes up and says that, and I feel like, okay, maybe it's just better if we don't talk about Feldenkrais.
sure, yeah,
But I mean, having said that, Moshe Feldenkrais was a scientist. He was a physicist and engineer. He worked in the in the Curie's lab in Paris. He was also the first European to get a black belt in Aikido, no, judo. Sorry, and one of involved in the development of what's known today as Krav Maga, martial art. He worked on the development of sonar. He multi-talented and very hard science and movement person. And he developed knee problems, long story. But at the time that he sought help for them from a surgeon in the 1950s, he was told that he would have a 50% chance of being able to walk normally if he had surgery. And he was enraged by that. He's like, that's the toss of a coin. You want to cut my knee for the a 50-50 chance that this is going to work? I'm sure I can figure out something better than that. And so he studied movement and motor learning and child development and just everything that he could find, and figured out how to teach himself to walk normally and without pain, without any, physical. Apparently, he could grab his kneecap and just move it around. Like, it was not a normal
Mm.
knee; it had been badly injured, but he had no problems with moving and using it when he was done. And then friends started asking for help with their bad backs and whatever, and it grew from there. And so we have the Feldenkrais method today. And science has caught up to a lot of um, uh, the foundational procedures, I guess. That's not really a great word, but anyway, that we use, the methodology, that's better. And so so the field that we now know as neuroplasticity is very good at describing what happens in Feldenkrais lessons, and is the best model we have now for that kind of learning process. But what it means that I can do in helping runners is address not just the mistaken ideas that they may have about how running works and what they're supposed to be doing when they run, of which there are a lot out there, but also, and more importantly, the mistakes that they have in the understanding of their own body and the world, and how effectively to interact with it in order to fulfill their intentions, in this case, to run. And if you don't address that level, the map of a person's self that they're working with, then all of the running form stuff that you try to put on top doesn't work. It doesn't work because their fundamental instructions for how to use their body don't work. So they try to implement and they can't. They try to implement and don't know if they have succeeded. They don't even know how they run because from inside they can't feel it. And so that's the level at which I can work. And from working at that level for more than 20 years, patterns emerged pretty early on. And of course, I've studied running as well, as much as I could. When I started working with runners, there was pose technique, there was chi running, there was Thomas Miller's program to run, which I thought was perhaps the best of them. And I bring that up because I just met Golden Harper, the
Oh yeah.
founders of Ultra, and I know that you run in Ultra shoes. Awesome. Yay. Uh, anyway, and he had lessons. Thomas Miller actually worked with him in childhood on his own running forms. So that's all baked into what they teach now. Anyway, so I studied all of that stuff. And of course, there's been a lot of research, and we understand gait better than we did from a scientific perspective, but it's still very limited in how they can study these things. And so I've been able to put that side by side with what I see happen consistently again and again with my clients and students, coming from however very different ways that they've been running. They tend to all converge. Once they have a better map, a better feeling, a better instinct, they're better running animals, they can tune their movement. It all starts looking more and more similar. And so that's given me an understanding of how the whole body works together, like general principles, even with different bodies, for how running works.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I've had like a number of different like movement specialists on the podcast, and a lot of it is kind of it gets to that point like you're describing where there's like this like foot in the kind of holistic, more like what's almost like a woo-woo method versus like what is actually science-based or what is actually evidence-based in terms of what we know. But the thing that always kind of comes across when I'm talking to people like that is they seem to have a lot of different things that, like you said, are tools that actually put the human body into motion in a way that gets them to a spot where now they can access these patterns of movement that they otherwise weren't able to before, that was more or less kind of causing the pain or leading to the discomfort of the injury they had in the first place. So it's almost like they're taking a person who's sort of removed themselves from what would just kind of intuitively be in a natural day of moving outside of our kind of modern society, place them back into that through a variety of different, each one of these methods kind of have their own kind of set of different like practices and movements, but they all sort of like essentially reintroduce a movement pattern that was more or less forgotten because we just didn't use it. And then things atrophy and we lose coordination with it because we're not doing it. And then also probably some strength atrophy things when we start to get into things like really built up shoes or braces and orthotics that get used beyond the time frame in which they're intended to kind of get over maybe an acute injury or something like that. And I always find like we kind of in that same place of just like the more variety you can kind of expose your body to, the more likely you're going to be able to kind of move through a pattern or go through a pattern of movements that you prefer. So in this case, running, without having that situation where you kind of have that first thing kind of go wrong that sort of influences the entire chain, so to speak, and then end up getting an overuse injury or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it's true. You've got to come out of that running situation. And I think for older people, it's the case that we very often have lost track of or forgotten how to do things, kinds of movement that we used to know because of all the play and exploration we did in childhood. But I think that situation is very different for younger people. And I hear this from coaches as well who work with younger runners, that they're just fundamentally different because more and more children have not had that period of physical play and exploration, or not nearly the quantity that it really takes to be a functional mover. And so a lot of stuff needs to be learned for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, when I think back to like my childhood, it was still in the world of like multiple recesses per day
Yeah.
and encouragement to do a bunch of different sports versus specializing. I would imagine we're getting a lot more kind of adult or elderly type issues with youth people coming up with the kind of specialization and maybe lack of movement that our younger generation's getting now.
Yeah, and it's digital life. They play on
Sure.
computers instead of.
Mhm. Yeah. And the other thing that's always interesting with this topic to me too is when I just think of just like sports and athleticism as a whole, I see I actually maybe see this improving to some degree at bigger, more, I guess, sophisticated running programs, or I guess maybe like Division One high schools and colleges probably would be better at this in most cases, just to better resources, better experts and things like that. But sometimes you get these situations where like people just assume running is a little more intuitive
Mhm.
than say like soccer or football or any of these other team sports that have like these skill sets. So they sort of historically kind of have lacked maybe the teaching of specific skills and specific movement patterns that would lead to developing a good running form or lead to like a good approach in terms of how to prepare for a workout and things like that. And it's almost like if I wanted to kind of like really simplify it, it's like, okay, you have this situation where like sometimes it's like, well, we got to have someone coach this cross country team, and no one wants to do it, so we're just gonna ask this teacher to do it, and they don't really have any interest or background in running other than like, all right, I'll do this. And it's like, what are they going to do? Like, they don't have a skill set to really help. So it's just like tell the kids to go and run a few miles and then have them come back.
Yeah.
And like, those are the type of situations that I think are like, okay, well, when I go and I'll do workouts down at Austin High here in Austin, Texas sometimes, and I mean they got a really big program, and I'm watching these kids warm up, and right now it's just like the state caliber runners because they're the ones that are still have a season left in front of them, and it's like they spend probably 30 minutes just getting ready for whatever their workout is, just doing all sorts of different drills and types of movement patterns and things like that that just kind of get them warmed up dynamically and ready to go. I'm just thinking to myself, I'm like, yeah, that wasn't the case always, especially not with small schools back when I was a kid. And I just wonder how much of a difference that probably makes having just like an actual protocol that's evidence based in terms of preparing the body to be ready to run and having that in the rotation enough where those kids probably could all just get up and go for a run without doing that because they have that in their pattern already, because it's part of the process normally. But if that's never there, then how many issues kind of end up downstream from that?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's great to hear. I mean, I think you're right that it's definitely not all high schools are doing that still, that's the lucky kids, the very lucky kids get that, and then hopefully and then we get into the weeds of hopefully they are doing the right stuff because sometimes it's like Pilates type stuff or whatever. But if
Yeah.
it's dynamic drills, that's, and as long as it's really varied, um, that's huge. But I occasionally work with teenagers, and usually these are teenagers who love to run. They're pretty fast. Their parents are trying to get them more help and advice because they're unhappy with their high school coach, and they feel like the kid is not getting what they need from their coach, especially movement wise. And so my experience is mostly with kids who do not have good coach, who have the kind
Mhm.
of situation you're describing, and they've been doing it for, and the coach has been doing it for 20 years and just doing the same thing always. So I think there's a lot of room for growth there. When I started working with runners, I came in, I had just retired from professional dance. So, movement variety and skill was my entire like profession. And um, it took me a couple years to realize that runners didn't think that way, and that my
Mhm.
business idea was pretty dumb. But it was too late at that point. Um, and but that was when I started working with. Well, I helped my first runner in 2002, so long time ago, and that was still the era when the main advice about running form for runners of all ages was don't touch it. Don't try and change it. You'll just get hurt. Everybody has a natural gait, which is preposterous because nobody's born knowing how to run. Every human learns to run. We're not like baby chicks who come out and like are immediately moving around. And
Mhm.
again, I think you know, there are a lot of incredibly wise and experienced coaches who love the challenge of learning and always getting better at coaching. But as you say, I think there are a lot of coaches also who have just been doing the same thing since that era, and have and are not dealing with the same type of kids that they were when they started coaching either. Again, much less physical kids. And nowadays, then they strap on a pair of super shoes on top of that,
Yeah.
and it's a bloodbath. So, yeah, um, there's
Yeah, it is interesting. I think like you had sort of the running shoe boom where we got like heel offsets and more cushioning, which I mean, to some degree, it's like I look at shoes as this like sort of like extension of the foot that does allow you to maybe reach into an environment for a longer duration than you maybe would be able otherwise if you were barefoot, especially if you get off onto like technical trail and things
mhm,
like that. But as soon as you make that like a scenario where now you're removing the body's ability to move naturally through its typical pattern, it's gonna change things, and super shoes are almost like another level to that, where it's like we're looking for we're getting a little more performance minded. I guess I would put all shoes in the realm of performance minded in the sense that, like, that's why we wear them in the first place for the most part is to try to improve performance. And it's like, if you think of it just through the performance lens, you're going to have some trade offs if you start to take the mindset of if a little bit's good, more must be better. So I think like you've probably seen some of this, but just kind of like the wake of potential injuries or imbalances that are created by people who are going to like maybe get into super shoes a little more often than they should outside of competition and key workouts and things like that.
yeah, yeah, a lot. And I've had a lot of discussions about it. I mean, I think it's still um, early days for a general understanding. And then the shoes are not all the same, so are they having the same effects? And
Mhm.
then we know people respond very differently to the shoes. That's part of the whole frustration with them. So
Mhm.
there's that. Um, my feeling, I'm seeing a lot of Achilles injuries, Achilles and hamstring, and I think And I worked with a Nike athlete in the early days, with of Super Shoes before they were public. I didn't know it was. I do my basically all of my work with elite athletes online, so I was not physically present with her. Just seeing videos, and stuff was just not working the way it has always worked with every other single runner of every level I've ever worked with. And it wasn't until like a couple years later when I understood the shoes that she was running in, and that started to make sense, because the shoes bias form much more than any other running shoe that I've ever seen people run in. So you just have a lot less latitude for how you run in those shoes. And I don't know, but I think the people who are super responders are the people whose shoes are finally helping them do something like extend their hips and get to their toes that they were never able to figure out how to do on their own. It doesn't take much movement or fitness work, especially for average runners, non-professionals, to get the same performance improvement that they supposedly get from super shoes without wearing them. So, right, a little bit of plyometrics gets you the same efficiency improvement. I know these days I have runners come to me who've been running for just a few years and they've only ever run in super shoes. And I get them running faster out of their super shoes than they did in. Like it doesn't take much of the right stuff to supply whatever those shoes are supplying, without without the downside, without the disability I feel they create. So they spare the effort in your lower legs. Well, so now your feet and lower legs are weaker than the rest of you. How's that a good thing? you know and then they prevent the big joint of the big toe from articulating. Well, that has fascial ramifications all up the backside, and then we're talking the Achilles and the hamstring things that seem to be commonly occurring. And they have Jae Gruenke has described a pogo stick effect, where the direction that you load them in is the direction they push back from, which I think explains what I've seen, that they significantly magnify anybody's asymmetries.
Mm.
And so that's where you get into the personal, like the shoes are the same, but different people get different injuries depending on whatever little asymmetry they had that's being magnified. So, I've got a lot of clients who feel they have to race in them and therefore they need to train in them a little bit, but we keep it to a minimum.
Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this podcast sponsors include S Fuels. They have a 15% offer for you. Element Electrolytes, they have a free sample pack offer for you. John G Apparel has 10% off, and Delta G Ketones has a 20% off and free consultation offer for you. Links and details can be found in the show notes and the episode landing page. You can also check out a full description of how I use all of these products in my own training and racing at the end of this podcast episode. Sure. Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I mean, the only argument that I have heard that practically makes sense to wear them as often as possible would be you do have a reduction in impact to some degree in certain areas anyway, and then you can run more miles. So it's kind of like this like closing the gap, so to speak, of the running sport and the other endurance sports that are lower impact, where we see like cyclists and triathletes and swimmers able to do higher amounts of volume because they've removed a lot of the impact from that. And now runners are getting a little closer to that volume because of the shoes. But then, if you introduce all those things you mentioned, it's like, where's the unintended consequence and like
Right.
the downstream ramifications? So it could be something where it's like, that's great for like a training block or two while you've still maintained some of the strength and some of the some of the benefits you had prior to the super shoes. But if you keep doing that season after season after season, eventually these unintended consequences are going to catch up with you.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's exactly right.
I was going to ask you one thing about what you said too, is like, cause my thought with the super shoes was like with the hamstring issues that we sometimes see, it was kind of a promotion of just being able to overstride a little bit more. And that was just engaging the hamstring a little bit differently.
Could be.
Is that something that's also unique with the big toe movement, or is it something that I'm missing altogether?
I don't understand it well enough, and I need to find because because when you're taught when I was taught anatomy, um, and you'd think anatomy would be set, like they figured it out a long time ago, right? And there's no new discoveries there, but that is not the case at all. And of course, a lot of people may be aware of this whole field of fascia research, the connective tissue that encases everything and then sets up everything, and it's all connected. Like when they say it's all connected, what they're talking about is fascia, as it turns out. And so these discrete um, anatomical structures are not discrete. They're all connected together. I've had I don't know who first said this. I heard Stu McGill talk about we're actually one muscle in 600 sacks. So like there's
Yeah.
the fascia is like one composite structure, and then we manipulate it by tightening this muscle or that muscle. And this is especially applicable to runners because the work of running isn't done by active contraction of the muscles that would appear to do those movements if you were, say, lying on your side or in outer space. In fact, the action of the muscles happens at completely other times and pre-stretches tissues or resists ground reaction force, but doesn't positively generate the movements. So it's a huge that's not new information, but it's just better and better understood and why it works that way. So, um, so we know that the big toe affects the arch. That's really clear. You've got this windlass mechanism that when the big toe bends, the arch shortens, and so when a runner comes onto their toes, the arch, which was stretched, is springing back, and that's part of what propels a runner forward. But those linkages continue on through the Achilles and all of the musculature and tendons in the back of the leg and hamstrings and all the way up to the base of the skull. And I have yet to find a fascial expert who's even heard of super shoes, right? There's and who can cut and who understands running gait enough to kind of wrap their mind around the question that I want to ask about. So what happens if we don't bend the big toe? What happens if we load the toe without bending the big toe? I mean, that's not a moment when there's much push forward on the whole runner's body. The push has happened earlier in the gait cycle. Like if it were just the big toe pushing us along, like that would be ridiculous. We know the big toe shortens the arch. And so at the point at which the runner comes onto the toes, ideally, though many runners don't, without the big toe bends, then the arch is shortening, and that helps propel the runner forward. However, most of the push in the gait cycle happens before the runner comes onto their toes. So I think I've not seen any data on this, but my impression is that really the key part of, or the function of that spring is to start to get the foot moving, because the foot has to accelerate faster than the runner was moving to go from being still on the ground to passing the runner's body and getting in front of them. And so that the spring off the ground that the big toe provides, I'm sure really helps with that. I don't know that it does that much more. But we know this fascial connection from the big toe through the arch, and it doesn't stop there. The fascia continues to be continuous through the Achilles and all of the tendons, the back of the leg and the hamstrings, and all the way up to the base of the skull. And so when you have more slack in the system because of the big toe not being bent, then how that affects the rest of the system in that phase of the gait cycle is a little difficult to track for me anyway. I'm having trouble finding someone who can track it with me, because if they understand fascia, they have never heard of super shoes and they don't know about running. So it's like, somewhere out there, if you're listening and you're that person who can talk with me about this, please get in touch. But I think also the fact that the big toe is not contributing to the ability of the foot to accelerate forward Then the spring is providing that action instead. Um, you know, I could imagine that it would create a sort of whip cracking kind of dynamic in the forward swing of the leg that could be very stressful to the hamstring. So that's one mechanical way that I can see that these shoes could stress the hamstring more. They're also just the height of them um, effectively make the runner's legs longer, and that is
Mm.
not a negligible change in forces. And then in super shoes, also people's mid stance is very long. Like if you look at the head movement, um, a person running in regular shoes, their head comes down. Your head is at its lowest point in mid stance when you're most compressed, and then starts to go up again pretty quickly. But a person in super shoes, the head comes down and it just stays really low as they rock across their foot and eventually go up again. And so that's also a big change in function through the whole leg and foot and whole body. And how, again, like how exactly those stresses change, I don't know. But it's abstractly, it's an interesting puzzle to be trying to solve. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, we have a lot of speculation with it at this point because, like you said, it's new enough where the market moves faster than the research, unfortunately.
yeah.
And one thing that is interesting, though, too, that I find somewhat unique to the super shoe setup of when it comes to kind of the amount of change we make with these sort of things is like when you think of its intended purpose, it's like it's a race day shoe, right? Like
Hmm.
when you look at race day targets for footwear historically, it was like a lower profile shoe. It was sort of this game of how strong can you make your lower legs and feet strong enough so that you can tolerate a racing flat? Or like if you wanted to wear a racing flat, which is the opposite of a super shoe in the sense that it's about as low to the ground as most runners are going to wear. It's about as firm of a shoe as most runners are going to wear. And it's like I have to do enough lower leg strength and conditioning and work in that product in order to be able to tolerate for the specifics of race day. So now we've sort of like flipped that entire product on its head and make it stacked up as high as it can be. Um, there is some regulations on it. It can't be higher than 40 millimeters in competition that is regulated anyhow. But there are shoes that are as high as 52 millimeters I've seen. So
Oh,
it's like
no, I did not know
insane.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, this is actually an interesting tidbit. When you look at, if you remember when Kipchoge did the Sub 2 project, the expedition. So it wasn't something that was like, it wasn't like if he had done like the London Marathon or Chicago Marathon where they would be following. And this was prior to the regulations, as I understand it too. That shoe that they wore for that actually was, I think it was 52 millimeters, and I think it had 2 carbon plates in it versus what you can actually have. Like if you roll up to the Chicago Marathon and you're someone who's going to be like on the podium and you have a shoe that's 52 millimeters and has 2 plates in it, they're going to disqualify you because
Right.
you can't have more than 1 plate and you can't be above 40 millimeters now. So it's just like the extent that you can take that and still see a potential benefit in the performance is beyond what we typically see in race day shoes now, at least legal ones. And to the degree that it's like exasperating what you just mentioned it just gets more and more.
Yeah.
But yeah, like to your point, it's like it's not even just like, oh yeah, we raised them up like, a handful of millimeters from their trainer. It's like, yeah, we did, but we also raised them up double or triple that from their actual race day shoe, which was the environment that we were replacing this product from.
Hmm. Yep. That's a great point. And then all other shoes have been pulled along by that, right? So,
Mhm.
you know, I try to get people, not just because I hate them, but for health and function and performance, I try to get people at least mostly out of super shoes. But I also try to get them out of maximalist shoes, and so to where they can feel the ground better. Because if you
Mhm.
can't feel what you're doing, you won't organize your movement well. It's just period. Because feedback loops are critical to that, and it is very hard. I keep a list of non-maximalist conventional running shoes to recommend to my clients. It's a very short list.
Mhm.
And it's just like I can't, my local running store, like I can't send people to a running store practically because everything, I mean, anything over 30 millimeters at the heel is technically a maximalist shoe. It's very hard to find a shoe that's not over 30 at the heel. I'm told that that trend is going to start reversing. I'm waiting for it.
Yeah. It is interesting because I always thought like if you were a conventional shoe brand that sort of followed the shoe development timeline of like 12 millimeter offset over the years, you still had a reason to have a low profile firm shoe on your product lineup because of race day specific stuff. So like if I were someone who like really wanted to get into low profile firm midsole, more minimalist skewed type of shoes, I could always just assume that like most of these major brands would have a racing flat that I could buy
Mhm.
and get into. Now it's like since they've replaced the racing flat with the super shoe, there's not the incentive to even have that model on the lineup
Mhm.
to the degree they did. So it's like you see that skewing, like you mentioned, like everything kind of gets lifted up with it, but then you also sort of eliminate in some cases the only reason some of these brands had a shoe like that on their lineup versus some of these other brands that kind of have a little more of a natural running or a minimalist play to it where they're going to keep a shoe on the lineup that has that just because that's part of their approach.
That is very clarifying, actually. Thank you for that perspective, because it never occurred to me that, yeah, that this is one of the reasons why all shoes have trended upwards. Is
Mhm.
that, I mean, for you, what do you feel you get about out of running in a zero drop, foot shaped, and non? I mean, I know Ultra has a range of
Non-maximalist.
cushioning. Yeah, a
Yeah.
maximalist shoe.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it as sort of like a tool that I need to keep in my rotation of just like if I'm spending too much time in a soft shoe, then I'm just not going to be working my lower legs the same ways if I have a firm lower profile option on. So to me, it's less of a like an either or question, and it's more of a like, how do I make sure I'm spending enough time in something that's a little more low profile so that I'm keeping that area engaged stronger and not atrophying to the degree it would if I went out of it altogether. So um, how much of that just like leans on like a history of running in lower profile shoes? You know, you could argue that since I spent so much time doing that historically, I have a relative advantage because I'm not trying to catch up to that or get up to that. I'm just maintaining what I had already acquired versus someone who maybe was in like a real support shoe for the last decade and really have had no exposure to low profile. And then they have to kind of like start from the beginning and like ease it in a little bit more. But that's kind of how I look at it. I look at it as like, all right, super shoes and maximalist shoes are something that I'll probably need to keep in my rotation to some degree for competition day if I want to keep up with the competition.
Mhm.
Um, but that's very much just a performance angle. I also want to look at it through the lens of, in order to fully in order to fully appreciate the benefit from a performance standpoint of what a super shoe is going to provide, it doesn't do me a whole lot of favors to atrophy the foot by doing that all the time.
Mhm.
So to me, it becomes a game of like, get your lower legs as strong as you can. Then when you do put on the super shoe, you have strong feet, strong lower legs, plus the potential performance advantage of this foam in the plate. But if you kind of go too far with that, if you treat it as of a little bit is good, more must be better, then you have
Right.
a situation where eventually, yeah, you have the benefit of the super shoe, but it gets back to what you were saying, where now we have all sorts of other atrophies and all sorts of other issues that are going on that are like kind of over time, maybe lowering that relative efficiency standard that you're going to get from the performance shoe or the super shoe.
Mhm.
So that's kind of how I've looked at it, at least over the last few years.
Mhm.
I'd be curious what your thoughts are on that. Is it like, is there a minimal dosage return you can get from keeping it in the rotation, or is it something where really ideally you're in something a little more low profile all the time and maintaining like a higher range of exposure to that sort of a fit and feel?
Well, um, where that threshold is, it probably varies from person to person, and
Yeah.
I can't pinpoint it. Again, my guidelines for my clients and students are about what you're doing, about the same. Is like, well, you got to train in them some, because otherwise you strap them on race day and like you can't figure out how to run, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you're not prepared for the unique stresses of those shoes.
Hmm.
And But only run in them enough to accomplish that, right? One run a
Hmm.
week, or I don't know, maybe you do your long runs in that, if it's a long race you're training for. Um, and the rest, yeah, we're looking to, and go potentially quite far in the opposite direction, to go to well, it's funny, maximalist doesn't mean a high offset anymore. So hopefully, and even the super shoes don't have high offsets. So it's not so hard to find something that's zero drop or close to it. Um, but try to get out of the maximalist range. Try to get down. There are a few shoes that come down below 20 millimeters offset at the heel. That's like shockingly low, right? I do try. The other thing that I do is try and have all my clients get into minimalist footwear for everyday wear, because those
Mhm.
are those are the shoes. That's where you spend most of your hours, and those are the shoes that need to change first. And the foot strengthening and the overall function you'll get from doing that is really significant. And then that gives you the ability over time to reduce your cushioning, so that you increase, because it's the cushioning that reduces the work of impact absorption of the foot muscles. And so they can get stronger and stronger. And so you get better and better feedback for your whole system, because it's not just about how the feet and lower legs function. It's about the feedback that helps you coordinate the whole system together. And people do find that they overall run better. Like once they've gotten far enough, that their Achilles aren't
Mhm.
so tight that they can't be in zero
Yeah.
drop or whatever, and they've got some strength, they find that they really run better, honestly, in minimalist footwear. I was just at the Anya's Barefoot Shoe Expo in Chicago,
Uh-huh.
and in running, it's easy to have the impression that the whole minimalist footwear movement died or shrank to a tiny little spark. But in
Mhm.
fact, it's been growing everywhere else.
Mhm.
There were 2,000 people at that expo. I met three different people who'd flown in from Alaska for it, and they didn't know each other. There were 40 vendors, and 20 more had been turned away due to lack of space. There were people of all kinds there, athletes and just regular folks, lots of people with kids, shopping for all kinds of shoes. Just this sort of big cross section, maybe skewing to a little more holistic, a little more paleo, but
Mhm.
people who have just discovered that they feel massively better in minimalist footwear for their lives, for daily wear. And so actually, it's it's going to be an increasingly large sector of the overall shoe market year after year after year. I
Mhm.
don't think it's reversible at this point, because those people can't be sold super shoes for performance benefits when they don't even
Right. Yeah.
run, right? And they've
Yep.
already discovered that the 20th century, like arch support, narrow toe, whatever, just actually is worse, not better. So
Mhm.
um, on that side of things, it's really growing, and every runner should be getting into shoes like that outside of running.
Yeah. Yeah, that's actually a really good point because if you look at the growth of minimalist and natural footwear, it is on a similar trajectory as it was in like the 2010 range when kind of like the Born to Run movement and all that stuff kind of really launched minimalist and low profile and natural running shoes in the running world. But it's with the health and fitness groups as much as it is anything.
Mhm.
And the thing I find interesting about that is one, it's probably a more sustainable group of people to grow within because they're not as one dimensional. They're kind of the hybrid athlete or the multi-dimensional person who's been in a gym for the last decade, who's done a lot of strength and conditioning stuff, who's done multiple of sports and things like that. It's interesting because, working with ultra footwear for the last 10 and a half years, it's been really interesting to watch the difference between the road runners and the trail runners in their acceptance of balanced cushioning. It's the trail runners have rarely ever, especially the through hikers, the outdoor people, they haven't really been concerned or bothered at all about the switch to balanced cushion. They just rolled with it and had very little issues with it right out the gate. And part of that's just because they're on very train all the time. So it's like their body's already exposed to all these different variations and impacts and varieties and things like that. So for them to go and for them to change something as small as like a nickel on the back of their shoe is not going to be as big of a difference because they're already on all that stuff versus the road runner who's on a very, very specific plane time and time again. switching that well, it wasn't one variable necessarily. They were usually like a scenario of, okay, I went down to balance cushion. I also eliminated all the cushion and all the support. So we're changing multiple variables, and then they're just plugging it into like their entire training program versus phasing it in and kind of describing it the way you have in terms of a transition. And it was just a little bit less of you get a little harder buy-in with that. So I think in terms of how much growth there is within natural footwear, lower profile stuff, minimalist stuff, a community like health and fitness is probably way more sustainable because it's just set up to have less of a like a steep hill to get up from correcting what was broken in the first place to
Mhm.
where they want to be eventually.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And then hopefully the specialty shops will respond to that too, because I think it's like when you get to the world of online sales and things like that, it's like where does the brick and mortar specialty shop fit into that? And it really is paralysis by analysis, where it's like there's thousands of different shoes out there. Which one do I get? Well, if I go into a specialty shop, I can lean on their team to help me narrow it down to a handful of options. Then I can try them on and identify which one feels most comfortable to me. Whereas, like, that's been very specific to the running and to some degree the walking community and a little bit to the outdoors too with, like, your REIs of the world. But, like, if you kind of open that up if they open that up, I should say, to, like, the greater fitness community where now you get people who are doing a variety of different sports or going into specialty shops to get that assessment in terms of, like, footwear choices and things like that, I think then you maybe open up the door for the natural running shoes, the minimalist shoes to kinda get back into that world if their customer base expands beyond the runner and into the hybrid athlete, the health and fitness person.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. I think the specialty running stores will be the last at this. I mean, setting aside the brand stores, right? The Nike store, the
Yeah,
Nike New Balance, well, that's whatever.
right. Yeah,
But
we'll see.
there,
Only time will tell.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I go to the gym. I look at the guys who are seriously lifting. They're all in their socks,
Yeah.
or the equivalent. Yeah,
Mhm.
and they're not going to change that. No one's going to be able to talk them out of that. So, and yeah, the demand is really there. It's true. You said something that I'm not familiar with, and balanced cushioning.
Oh, yeah. So balanced cushioning is sort of just a way to describe zero drop in a way
Mm,
that's so here's kind of what happened. Like, so Ultra launched and they kind of coined the term zero drop more or less. And it was like, okay, zero drop is this idea that, your forefoot and your heel are on equal planes. And at a certain point, Ultra wanted to describe it more holistically, where it was like zero drop with the word zero there kind of sends the mind towards no cushion versus just same distance off the ground. So balance cushioning is maybe just a broader scope where
mhm.
it's like you could have 12 millimeter, 12 millimeter, 24 millimeter, 24 millimeter, 30 millimeter, 30 millimeter. Those are all balanced cushioned, whereas zero drop maybe kind of gives the idea that it's going to be closer to that like 12 and 12 or closer to the minimalist side of things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. It does make sense. I heard an interesting interview. I was actually Golden Harper on Stephen Sashen's podcast, CEO of Zero Shoes, Stephen Sashen.
Yeah. Hmm.
And they were talking about the history of it all. And he said
Yeah.
something which I didn't realize. Another reason why people heel strike when the heel is more cushioned than the forefoot is simply the weight. The weight
Oh,
of the
yeah.
heel part of the shoe makes it swing forward more. So it's not just sensory that I can't feel the
Mhm.
ground or whatever, or that I want to overstride. It's just physics. And so
Yep.
balance cushioning would seem to also talk about that as an interesting idea. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's where I think like a product, like a good example of this from Ultra's line is the Ultra Torin is one of the reasons that's one of their leading road selling shoes is because it's not maximalist, but it's moderate to high moderate cushion. So if somebody's coming from a cushioned shoe and they were in, say, an 8 to 12 millimeter offset, and then they're getting into the Torin where they're still in, I think the Torin's 28 millimeters forefoot and heel, if I'm not mistaken.
Sounds right.
It's somewhere between 25 and 28. They're sort of just changing one variable. They still have that soft step and feel, but they're eliminating that movement that you were describing where the back half of the shoe is significantly heavier than the front half. So they're not going to get that artificial like play with their mechanics. and they're getting back into that balanced cushion, but they're not necessarily changing so many variables where they have to like phase it in over the course of maybe like 4 to 6 months. They can sort of just put that shoe on and treat it like any new shoe, phase it in for a couple of weeks so you get used to just any uniqueness to it from what you had in before. But over that period of time, you're going to start to kind of adapt to it and get used to it, and not have to worry so much about that shoe like causing an injury because you got into it too soon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Makes sense.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic. I think I mean, I find it all interesting, just the way the minimalist movement kind of came in and kind of it almost grew too fast to the degree where like the shoe industry was where it was, and then all of a sudden you had people running in like the most supportive gait manipulating type technologies to a Vibram five finger. It's
Right.
like
Right. Well,
it's
and
like
I think that gets back to what we were talking about at the beginning, this idea that humans have a natural way to run, um and we just figure it out basically. That old idea about running form, and that still maybe predominates at the high school level. But and turns out that people needed a learning process to go
mhm,
from, to do exactly what you said and get into these minimalist and like, no cushion. I mean, I think Vibram five fingers it's a little hard to feel actually what you're doing in them, but, um, and people didn't have that, and there wasn't enough time, and they didn't have a large enough repertoire of movement, and enough sensory feedback to make the adjustments to run in them and not get injured. And then people started giving bad advice about running form at the same
yeah.
time. And so it was just a perfect storm of this is not going to work. I talked to Stephen Sashin about this also. It's like, I thought when minimalist footwear came in, oh, well, that's me out of a job, because you can just feel how you're supposed to run. But that's not what happened, actually. People needed more help. In many cases, they got worse. And it spawned the running form teaching industry.
Mhm.
Like there was a little before, but all of a sudden people were like, well, how am I supposed to run? And bad advice got given, and we know what happened.
Yeah. Well, and that's actually a great transition because I had a topic I wanted to chat to you about, which was just kind of like some running form principles that people can think about if they want to say like, okay, I grew up at that small Division 3 school where the cross country coach was a great person but didn't have a running background, and we
Mhm.
didn't do any education on this. We just ran and everyone did the best they could. But now I've got this issue I'm dealing with, and I wanted to talk a little bit about some characteristics about, I think, the running mechanic that you probably have some great insight in. The first one is just kind of like the forward lean
Mhm.
aspect of things. When you hear forward lean from like an educator standpoint, what are you telling runners to think about with that?
So I've recently changed how I talk about that, because I started out using Danny Dreyer's phrase of lean forward from the ankles, but
Mhm.
the legs continually move in running, so that's not a good reference point actually. That it describes the moment of initiating running from standing. You sway forward and to one side so you can free a foot, and that's the only moment you lean forward from the ankles. But what we do have and do need, in varying amounts depending on what we're doing, is a forward trunk inclination. That's the technical way to describe this. So that no matter where your legs are in the gait cycle, from the hip joints honestly, uh, to the atlas vertebra, the top vertebra, you've got a forward angle. So that's not the only thing you need to know, because then where are you relative to your feet is a separate and important, well, it's related, but important question. Um, and then the lean is speed dependent. And and I should also add that I'm talking about distance running. So all of my advice and
Sure.
all of my expertise is in distance running. So and this
Sprinters
particular
tune
thing
out.
might work quite differently with sprinting. So yeah, and your listeners are distance runners anyway. So, but anyway, so the forward trunk inclination has many purposes and functions, and that should be true. That's one of your yardsticks for good running form advice, is if there aren't multiple reasons to do a thing, and if it doesn't interact in a positive way with all the other good things that should be happening with your running form and promote them, then there's something wrong with that advice. And it may be that you're just struggling, but probably there's something wrong with that advice. So forward lean to some degree reduces drag, so air resistance. And that's instinctive, right? If you've ever walked into a stiff wind, you just lean forward. That's what you do. And so, and this can make, over the course of a marathon or more, it can make a meaningful difference in outcome, reducing that drag. It also tilts your pelvis forward. So there are legions of runners out there trying not to tilt their pelvises forward, but to lean forward. I don't know how you do that. Like, if everything else is tilting forward, your pelvis is going to tilt forward. The problem comes in when not everything tilts forward together, when maybe your pelvis tilts and your upper body doesn't, and you get a very arched lower back. And so that tilting forward of the pelvis means that your leg can extend behind you without the hip joint being so hyperextended, right? You have a lot more like hip joint range of motion behind you than otherwise. And so that allows you to lengthen your stride. That makes it a lot easier to run uphill. And it lines you up so that the push from your foot in late stance goes through your body and not like out in front of your body because you're leaning backwards, right? Can you picture, does that make sense? That you need to, the thing that you want to push forward with your foot, which is the rest of you, needs to be in position to be pushed by your foot, right? And so the lean accomplishes that. And so there's this relationship between stride length and forward lean on the flat. And the more you want of the one, the more you need of the other. So that's it in a nutshell.
Interesting. And perhaps I need an update in kind of how I'm describing this, but I'll describe to you kind of what I've said in the past, and you tell me if I'm kind of working from the old way of doing this or if there's something different that people can use. When I've described forward lean to people to get someone kind of to feel it and kind of get in a rotation of sort of like knowing kind of how to put themselves into that position, I'll just have them kind of stand in like an upright posture and just start kind of rocking back and forth. And then just kind of do that comfortably, not so far back or so far forward where you feel unbalanced, but get comfortable in that position. And then once you get there, rock forward enough where you start to lose that sense of, okay, I feel balanced here. And at that point, raise the leg and step forward. And that kind of puts you in that position where you got the forward lean and you're sort of falling forward and catching yourself with your foot versus trying to kind of drive yourself forward with your legs.
Mm-hmm.
Am I heading in the right direction with that sort of a practice? Is that something people can use to kind of practice their forward lean?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And it gets you out of there's a whole, actually, elite runners are more likely to do this, but you don't see Africans do it. But Americans and like British runners are big on this, on the stompy start, like to boom, 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 and then they're running, like to create ground reaction force by accelerating the foot towards the ground. And that just puts you behind your feet and for the foreseeable future until you stop running. So yeah, that sway works. There's a trick. So the thing about the forward lean is, I said, to the atlas vertebra, right? The vertebra upon which your skull rests. Your skull needs to stay oriented forward or to look around. This is where an athlete who plays any other sport has a huge advantage over someone who's a pure runner in terms of coordination, because they've had to learn how to run while looking wherever they need to look for their game, right? And so their heads tend to be much freer and they have better forward leans. So I talk about your face forward, have the idea that your face is leading the way when you run, and your spine, so as part of that sway forward, if you do it with your chin down like this, your brain is going to reject that pretty fast. A person who does it that way is going to lean forward for the first few steps, and then they're going to come upright because they can't see where they're going. And your brain, your nervous system prioritizes that as a survival thing over optimal running form. But if you move your face forward and you just let your body sway in response, I'm going out of frame, but hopefully you can see what I mean. That sets you up better. This actually, Mark Cucuzella calls this giving granny a kiss. We talked about it because he was having trouble. He developed the 1-2-3 run program for the U.S. Air Force to help teach running form, and he was having trouble getting people to lean forward. And so I shared this with him, and he switched it to, because it's this action of the head is also connected to the sucking reflex. And so if you actually, and you do this movement when you go to give a person a kiss, right? You go, and so that's a hack. Like, you wouldn't necessarily want to do that at the starting line of a race. I don't know. Maybe everybody else is.
I'm just picturing the front row of the starting a race, all pretending to like air kiss the.
Yep. But it does give you that feeling. It helps you separate, because not everybody can feel. I mean, everybody could, but this is a problem that occurs for people in running that shows up that you only end up seeing the ramifications of, but you don't see the cause, is not having that freedom here to use the spine separately from the head. So a trick to be able to find it is to do that kissing action. And I remember watching Shelly Ann Fraser-Price, a Jamaican sprinter, like in the later stages of a sprint, she'll go, just instinct, like she just found it in her body, how to find that extra ability to get herself forward. So I'm sure she's not the only one.
That's interesting. I want to move down kind of you started kind of with the top with the forward lean to some degree, and then kind of move to like arm swing, which in and of itself is kind of a poorly labeled way to say arm, because swing kind of insinuates like forward and backward, in my opinion. And I always go back. I'm really curious about what you're gonna have to say about this. I go back to like, I'm at a cross country meet or a track meet, and the coach is there, and they're coming down that finishing chute in cross country or the home stretch on track. And inevitably, historically anyway, you'd hear a coach swing your arms, or they would teach the kid to swing their arms because their legs can move as fast as their arms, or something to that degree. And the more I think about it, I'm thinking like an arm swing should almost, like, if we really want to influence the forward motion of running, I don't think we necessarily have to be thinking like just in a linear motion, because you also hear things I think is kind of bad advice of like, don't bring your arms in, or don't twist your torso at all. Keep that straight, which I think is kind of resisting the natural movement to some degree.
Yeah.
But even more, like, if I have someone swinging their arm forward, that is actually creating a reverse sort of force in the wrong direction. It's almost kind of pushing me back. Versus if I pop my arm back, that's kind of pushing me forward. And then at that point, I almost want to just relax my arm versus swing it forward. So when I tell people what they should think about their arms, I think like kind of keep your arms bent at like a 90-degree angle. Maybe avoid swinging past your sternum, but don't be afraid to kind of let your torso kind of engage. But really, like, if you're going to give any sort of influence to that swing of the arm, make sure it's in the reverse direction, and then relaxing it and letting it fall forward versus swinging it forward. Anything in there that stands out as good advice versus bad advice?
Well, so arm swing is enormously influential on how your whole body works. And again, I agree with you. It's nice. I've never really thought about the word itself as problematic, but you're absolutely right. But it's enormously variable depending on every moment of your running. So how fast are you trying to run? How tired are you? How fast were you running before? Are you going uphill? Do you need to balance yourself? Is it uneven terrain? It's way more variable than leg action, and very determining of leg action. But it's also not separate. I think arm swing is okay. Well, if you look at the biomechanics, they'll tell you arm swing has to happen to counteract the scissoring force of the legs. Otherwise, you just spin in the air. So it's the counter rotation of from the arms that keep you going forward in the air. Sure, but if we stop there, we miss a vast quantity of nuance that affects your running health and your performance. And honestly, how good running feels. So I think most important way to think about arm swing is as a way of creating and managing ground reaction force. And so that's your spring and your power. And that how much of that you want depends enormously on what it is you're trying to do. Are you trying to run 100 miles or are you trying to run 100 meters?
Yeah.
Right? Um,
Yeah.
because various choices will have more cost, and also more power. Um, so if you look at it closely, you'll see that the arm swing is out of sync with the legs. So they don't scissor at the same time. The arms do their counter swing action slightly later than the legs. And so you can always tell, like a picture where someone's just pretending to run, but they're actually standing still because they've got their arms lined up exactly opposite their legs. And you glance at it and you're like, that's fake, right?
Yeah.
Because instinctively, no one ever looks like that when they're actually running, right? So the arm swing doesn't. So if you think about the apparatus of the upper body, it's very complex compared to the hips. Like hips, you got the pelvis, you got these ball and tremendously mobile ball and socket joints, which are the hip joints, and the pelvis can move, and the femurs can move in the hip joints. Below the knee, it gets very complicated again. But that's pretty simple. But in the upper body, you've got the shoulder girdle, so your collarbones, and they meet your shoulder blades out here. Your shoulder blades have no joints that connect to your spine or your torso. They're just islands of bone that float around back there. The only place that your shoulder girdle, and thus your arms, are connected to your body is right here at the top of where your collarbones meet your sternum. And so that gives an enormous amount of mobility. But if your arm swing only comes from here and from the humerus in the very open and mobile joint of the shoulders, then you're not. There's very little impact on your legs, and you run and feel like Frankenstein.
Mhm.
So in fact, the upper spine turns, and that this counterbalances the rotation of the pelvis, and then also moves from side to side because your weight needs to go over one foot and then over the other foot, because unlike there's no seat in running like on a bike, you can't keep your weight in the middle without consequences, the most common of which is IT band syndrome. And the ribs are super mobile, and the thoracic spine is super mobile, and the lumbar spine excels at side flexion. Not a lot of rotation. The apparent rotation of the pelvis comes from the lower thoracic spine mostly. But so your arm swing is leverage on, and also to some extent outcome of this complex action, this potentially rich and complex and powerful action of your torso. And when you see and look at like the younger Kennedy Sabakele, if you want to see perfection, and you'll see his head goes like this, which should always be happening for a runner. But and that comes not because you've just decided to do a thing with your head, but because your spine is moving.
Mm.
And so your arm swing comes from this whole, the whole, like from your lowest rib up, from your thoracic spine up. And it's not happening by itself because your lumbar spine and your pelvis need to be moving as well, the opposite direction. And so to a certain extent, because it's true that something needs to counteract the scissoring action of your legs, if you just do a big movement with just your arms, your torso, your spine, your ribs, your head, they're not going to move much because you're producing enough force to counteract. If you produce more, then you'd be rotating because you're overdoing it with your arms, right? You lose control. Although at high enough speeds, like sprinting speeds, everything's moving.
Mm-hmm.
But for a distance runner, we want to find a balance where it's not just the arms counteracting or counterbalancing the scissor force from below, but the whole torso. And so you'll see all kinds of strategies for this. Like the classic Ethiopian strategy is the hands are up by the collarbones, right? If you think about
Hmm.
Tirnesh Baba, running, and you see this action, which is pretty incredible. And the higher up, the more mobile the spine is high up, the easier the legs work, the more unstable and easily perturbed a runner's balance is. And we want that as runners because that makes us very easy to move. It just takes a little bit of effort to get us to move, as opposed to being really stiff and locked down, and then the legs have to really grind, right?
Hmm.
So I say as a I mean, I could talk for this for another couple hours, but if I want to encapsulate a little bit here, um, uh, my guideline is to bring your hands to your heart because, and that means that captures a lot in it. So that means your elbows are going to stick out. The elbows must stick out because the muscles that you because your upper body is rotating. And so if your upper body is doing this, how's your arm going to do this? Well, only by you doing really funky things with your rotator cuffs. And
Mm.
so if your arms are just riding that movement of your upper body, this is the action the elbows stick out. Of course, there's such a thing as too much, but I'm way less worried about that for most runners. Um, and so the knuckles to them overcrossing a little bit, most people do on one side. It's way less of a problem than undercrossing. Because if you anything that you do to keep your hands from coming to your midline slightly, like even just out here, um, contracts muscles between your shoulder blades in your upper back, reduces the rotation of your upper body, and thus the freedom of movement of your legs. It actually has a massive, massive consequence. So I definitely want the knuckles to be free to come to the zipper, so to speak. And if they go a little beyond, we won't worry about that, unless there are major asymmetry issues that are leading to injury. And then we need to look at the big picture and not just the arm.
Sure.
Um, and then this also means that you've got a more acute angle than 90 degrees. Because if you think about a 90-degree angle has your hand the maximum distance from your elbow. So for the bicep alone, that's going to be more work than higher or lower. So that's the most effortful position for your arms. Swinging a straight arm is a very slow pendulum, and like I don't know.
Yeah.
Wasn't there an elite Japanese woman who in the anyway, there are a few who've pulled it off with such phenomenal strength, and
Hmm.
that I long to see how they could run if they just didn't spend all that energy
Yeah.
fighting their arms. These things kill me. Um,
You know what's interesting about you maybe know this already. I was actually just in Japan recently and was kind of diving in a little bit into like Japanese running culture and history, and that's actually taught to have that like that obtuse angle of like the forearms really low and swing. Like that's how they're taught to run it. So it kind of a reverse issue of what we see here and described before of like a lack of education with form. They've got that piece of the puzzle plugged in of the education. Unfortunately, it seems like it's maybe not the best practice that they're educating. So you see a lot of runners with that sort of that arm carriage in the Japanese running culture because of that, from what I'm told anyway.
yeah, I mean, it really is the downside of expert education by experts, right?
Yeah,
Um,
when it's wrong. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so,
Yeah.
and this gets us back to like if especially if running is a fundamental human gait. So we're not talking about gymnastics here, we're not talking about
Mhm.
motocross, we're not talking about like sports that humans have made up that kind of use our functions, but this is like a gait of our species. And so we see it best in its most natural settings, right? And like again, if you watch like relatively active kids just run, the one kid running with straight arms is the kid about whom there's a lot of dysfunction in their movement.
Mhm.
That kid would immediately draw your eye, and you would think, is there some wonder what's going on there, right?
Mhm.
Because everybody else has their elbows bent. So that's a clue that this is actually how running works. And it's possible to create all kinds of theories that sound good on paper about how running should work. but you gotta test them. So yeah, don't listen to experts. Well, I mean, that's actually, I mean, that gets us back to the Feldenkrais method, really, because it makes you your own expert. You're
Sure.
the person. Like, I talk a lot about how running works because I want better information out there, and I don't want other experts telling people to run with their arms straight because it will hurt them. But I don't tell my students how to run.
Mhm.
They die for a straight answer from me. I instead, if there's something they don't understand, it's my job to create the circumstances, create a situation where they figure it out for themselves. And it feels very loose and open because on their part, it has to be exploratory because you don't own a thing until you figured it out for yourself. On my end, it's highly structured, helping the person come to this conclusion. It just doesn't feel that way from the inside. And that's why running form improvement made that way becomes natural and instinctive. It's not a thing a person ever needs to think about. And no person who came to a good arm swing that way would ever believe an expert who told them that they were supposed to run with their arms straight.
Mhm.
And and it's Moshe Feldenkrais lived under more than one totalitarian regime in his life, and giving people the tools to judge for themselves was incredibly important to him, and that's baked into the method. I think that gets to the bigger
Mhm.
picture. Um,
Sure.
but back to arm swing. So you've got your elbows bent that much, your hands are coming to your heart, which means which also then helps you run with what I call a good core action. So that's a term that I coined in 2013 because we needed an accurate alternative to core stability, which sounds like holding your core still. It's not what the term was meant to mean originally, but that's what it sounds like. And there are legions of runners out there trying to lock it all down.
Yeah.
So the core action is the counter rotation of upper and lower body. There's a right amount. It varies depending on the situation. Too much is salsa dancing. We know what that looks like. But
Yeah.
too little is way too much work. And then the toll on the legs is enormous. And this gets back to the whole like cushioning and pounding thing is like if your form is really functioning well and you're moving across your feet, the toll on your lower extremities is so much less that cushioning starts really becoming much more optional.
Mhm. Yeah, it kinda leads me into the next one that I wanted to ask you about, which is just kinda like where your foot is actually striking the ground. Because I feel like this one oftentimes gets, like, misrepresented where you'll see people that wanna paint a black and white picture of like, "Oh, you should be a forefoot or a midfoot striker or avoid heel striking." And my understanding is, like, whether you're striking kind of up in your forefoot, your midfoot, closer to the back part of your foot, the more important kind of piece to that is where is that planting point in relation to your knee bending? And if your leg or your lower leg is out in front of that knee and you're almost creating this like straight, slanted mechanic, that's where you're going to end up driving impact forces up into the knees and hips and lower back in areas you don't necessarily want them to go versus that plant is coming down underneath that bent knee and you're actually kind of absorbing those impact forces in the way that the body's more mechanically inclined to distribute them in the ways that it can support it.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so basically I agree. And there was Daniel Lieberman and team, did a follow-on paper to their endurance running and the evolution of Homo paper in journal Nature. At the beginning of the whole minimalist natural running movement, and it was this follow-up paper was what we can learn about running from barefoot running. And one of the findings is this supple leg at foot strike. It's not so much about where the foot meets the ground. That's going to vary. It's going to vary again, terrain, fatigue, speed, all of that. And even experienced barefoot runners will heel strike sometimes. It's not like you need, if your foot strike is not adaptable, something's wrong.
Mm,
But it's that straight knee out in front of you, pushing you backwards, that is much more damaging. And so, and then at the same time, a lot of people still use the term sort of like forward lean from the ankles, landing with your foot under your center of gravity. And that was popularly said, again, back in the early days of the natural running movement. And first, center of gravity, okay, like, how are you going to pinpoint that? That's not an anatomical point. And that has a lot to do with how you're organizing yourself in gravity. So that's not very useful. You cannot land with your foot underneath your hip joint, because your foot needs to be under your hip joint in mid stance. Otherwise, that's the point at which you have 2.7 times your body weight pushing down, in the ground. That's when you're experiencing that compression. You have to have your foot under your hip joint at that moment, or the muscular work you have to do to deal with the compressive forces is going to cause injury. And I think it's not foot strike, but the way that foot strike signals a gait cycle where the relationship between the foot and the rest of your body is not optimal. In fact, the forces that tend to cause injury happen at mid stance, not at foot strike, because that's the largest force in the whole gait cycle is at mid stance. So if your weight is a little bit behind your foot in mid stance, you're going to be miserable in the knees, among other things. So I'm not too concerned about that actual. I mean, it can be a person landing with a ramrod straight knee with their heel in front of them is probably going to find foot strike unpleasant. But it's still that mid stance loading that's the real problem. So you cannot land with your foot underneath you. And I wish people would stop trying or thinking that they're doing something wrong by not doing that. Because that means your foot will be behind you by the time your weight is, by the time you're experiencing that compressive force. And then people tend to develop calf and hip flexor problems. It's very hard to get your leg in front of you again for the next stride. And so then your hip flexors get overworked and irritated. So generally speaking, if the shin is vertical at foot strike, that's about right. But again, like terrain, etc.
Sure, yeah.
So as long as the knee is flexible, as long as the knee is bent, you're probably fine. And because how the legs work really comes from the torso. If you got your head right, if you got your arms right, if you got your core moving properly, your foot strike is going to optimize on its own.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think like a lot of those things tend to clean up a little bit, at least I mean, I don't know, maybe this is like I guess a chicken or an egg type of thing with cadence, where for one thing, I think like cadence often is also a problem in the sense that people target a very specific number where it's actually like you're gonna have a range
Mm-hmm.
and it's likely going to be lower at your slower pace and higher at your faster pace. And maybe that averages out to some arbitrary number like 180 or something like that. But generally speaking, you probably want to be working within that range. But is it something where like if someone does have a really low cadence, it's just more likely that they're overstriding and just creating that environment where because their cadence is low is because they're trying to like overreach and maybe they're covering more ground with each stride, but they're taking less steps versus them kind of tightening that up a little bit. They're going to more or less kind of bring that overstriding back in. What are your thoughts about kind of cadence in general and what people can use it for as a tool?
Yeah, well, so here's the thing is I still have not settled my mind on this issue of cadence. The thing that I'm quite confident about is it's an outcome rather than an input. And if you're not very springy, we need to figure out why. First culprit is likely shoes. Are they maximalist? Are they stability? Do you have orthotics in there that we can deal with that and getting the springiness back in your feet? Are you not releasing your weight from the leg that you're trying to leave? That'll slow you down. And then, yes, it could be the big overstride and that impulse to pull yourself with your feet rather than to push yourself with the feet. Those are the most obvious culprits. I mean, spring is created through the body and not just the legs. Like core action again is like, but and the fascial linkages, you're just one big spring. And if there's any part of you that you're not allowing to be part of that spring, then there are going to be issues with your cadence. Um, I think it's fine to experiment with your cadence. I think it's fine even to use it as one um, uh, uh, one lever you can flip when you're like really tired or when you're looking for extra speed and you don't know where you can find it in your body. I mean, to run faster is to run differently, and to run faster tired is to run differently than to run faster fit, right? So you need a lot of like mastery is to have a command of a huge range of options and to be able to deploy them effectively, right? And so cadence can be a lever that you flip. It's like getting super tired. Well, I'm going to pick my cadence up, and that can actually increase your speed without increasing your effort in that moment. But it would be the wrong choice, like at the beginning of the race when you're feeling fresh, and might even slow you down. So mostly, I think it's important to just let it be. I find
Mm-hmm.
when um, that when as my client's form comes more into optimal for most of my kind of competitive amateur runners, um, their cadence will and we get the footwear sorted. Their cadence usually settles in the low 170s. Um, and might be lower, of course, speed dependent also, might be lower than that for a recovery run. That's fine. And again, would be variable. And I think that's a sign of health. But if it's super slow and it's always slow and it's always about the same, no matter how fast you're trying to run, then there's a lot of learning that needs to occur. And all of that is a lot vaguer than I wish it were. But 20 years, that's as far as our 21, that's as far as I've gotten. I
No,
think it's popular to tell people to increase their cadence because it's something a doctor can say in their office. And it will reduce overstriding. Like, like a person's injury issues may improve, but that doesn't mean that their gait improved. If your only way of running better is to make your leg action smaller, then the rest of you is not moving very well.
mm. It's like anything, you can't just do one thing and hope it all to get better.
Right, right, and especially such a
Bummer.
complex system as humans, you know? Yeah,
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Well, Jay, I mean, this has been awesome to chat with you about some of these topics, and I know we ventured quite a bit into the world of speculation with super shoes and things like that in
yeah,
the beginning, but I think it's just a conversation that we need to kind of keep having as we kind of wait for more and more details to come out about some of the stuff and the proper way to maybe use those tools. But everything has been great in terms of just being able to kind of learn some stuff from you and hear what your thoughts are. But before I let you go, if you can kind of share with the listeners anything that you have coming up or where they can find information about you and explore kind of what your offerings are like.
sure. So, first off, I'm in Salt Lake City and getting back to an in-person practice after many years and certain
Oh, cool.
interruptions that we all know about. But for me, also a bunch of international moves that just made it harder to work in person. So I'm going to be doing some teaching this summer and seeing clients in person starting this summer. But I'm always around online. If people want to get a taste of all the things that I've been talking about here in terms of running form, I have a free 1 week mini course called the Mind Your Running Challenge that you can find on my website. So my website is balancedrunner.com, and balancedrunner.com/mind your running will get you to the challenge, or you can just look through from any blog page, you can find it. So that's just a 10-minute lesson a day for a week to get you feeling what that trunk inclination feels like, the core action, these kinds of things, the weight shift, the arms. To dive deeper, my main offering is an online course called the Balanced Runner System Online Camp. And I do one-to-one coaching online as well. So balancedrunner.com is the hub of all of that.
Of all that stuff. Well, awesome. Well, thanks a bunch for taking some time and chatting with us about this stuff and sharing some of your wisdom.
Thank you so much. Real pleasure talking with you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Take care.
You too.
Hey everyone, thanks for sticking around to hear more about how I use the products that sponsor the Human Performance Outliers podcast. I have updated a few things, so if you follow closely, you may notice some new details here. I have taken a lot of time identifying these brands, and I'm incredibly grateful that they have provided a product that I use routinely and are also interested in supporting my work here at the Human Performance Outliers podcast. So here is how I use them. S-Fuels is a product that follows a principle of right fuel at the right time. For me, this means I can anchor my nutrition in a fat-dominant way, but not neglect the powerful application of carbohydrates when they are needed. Their product lineup maps the low-carbohydrate dietary protocol that I have used for endurance since 2011. Here's how I use some of their product lineup and some of their second-generation products that they've just recently brought to market. First is their Zone 4 and Zone 5 product. I use these for intra-workout and race carbohydrate targets. I will use the Zone 4 in less glycolytic settings that still benefit from some carbohydrate, and Zone 5 for workouts that I prefer, workouts and races where I want to maximize my carb to other fuel source exogenous inputs. In short, I prefer Zone 5 when my carb inputs are at their highest and I want to kind of go straight to that source. Zone 2 is a fat-based powder that uses C8 and C10 MCTs that are combined with L-glutamine. I use this for lower intensity workouts to help promote higher fat oxidation rates without neglecting energy deficits. So in short, if I'm doing something longer and I want to keep carbs out, but I don't want to have a huge calorie deficit, Zone 2 plays a great role there. Revival is a post-workout race protein powder that I can easily add to some yogurt or a low-carb smoothie to quickly jumpstart the recovery process. I will use a product like this most often when I'm completing training sessions and have a lower appetite or desire to eat solid foods right after, but want to get a jumpstart on replacing some of the stuff that I left out there. Primed is my go-to caffeine source for training and racing. It combines green tea extract, L-carnitine, taurine, and B vitamins, which all combine to help support energy production, fat metabolism, and reduce perceived effort. Life Bars are a product that have been one of my favorites on the S-Fuels lineup for some time now, and they are a great combo of healthy fats and protein that I can have prior to a big training session, race, or simply as a snack on heavier training days. Grain-free breakfast cereal is something that I can sub in for just about any time I would have put granola on something when I was a more moderate high-carb person. So this is a good substitute for that. Oftentimes I will put it on top of things like yogurt as a topper or something like that. If you're interested in more details about their product lineup, the science behind it, and everything else, head over to sfuelsgolonger.com for up to 15% off your next order. And stay tuned for some product giveaways and promos over the course of the year. I got introduced to Janji last year and have really enjoyed having some of their products in my running and gym rotation. Janji makes pants, shorts, outerwear, tops, and accessories. Janji apparel is made with durability in mind and is backed by a 5-year run everywhere guarantee. Each design is informed by a different part of the world through collaboration with local artists and in partnership with clean water nonprofits with whom they have contributed over $1 million donated to clean water solutions. Some key features that Janji really focuses on is lightweight, breathable, moisture wicking, odor resistant, thermal regulation, and a super soft and flexible material. Here are the products that I've been using a lot so far this summer. I'm still going with the AFO middle short for very light, breathable training sessions where minimal pockets and extras are not desired. So think a very humid summer training run where I want as little on as I can get away with and feel like it's not getting bogged down with a bunch of sweat. The 5-inch multi-short. So I'll sub this one in for sessions where I do want a bit more storage capacity that is placed in the right areas or the right spots. So think things like where I put my phone, does it sit nicely? Or is there a spot to put my key where it's not flopping around or poking me in an awkward place or things like that? So I really like the 5-inch multi-short for that sort of a training session. A product I'm really excited about, which isn't necessarily a training gear per se, is the Multipass Mini and Sling Bags. These are the newest items I have started using from Janji. The only question for me is how much stuff do I need, which will determine which one of these I will bring with me. The Multipass is a great for just stashing things like your keys, wallets, phones, headphones, or any item you want to have with you, all while keeping your pockets free from clutter. It's got a nice clippable strap that you can put around your waist or over your shoulder. I'll upgrade to the sling bag if I'm bringing a little more stuff and it's just not enough room inside that multi-pass mini. So think things like the size of a water bottle, or if I'm just going to be on a little longer session or heading to the airport or something like that, and I just need more storage, but with that same type of design with the waist and shoulder options and the clippable strap. So those are two of my new favorite options. Check those out. You can head to janji.com and get 10% off any of those items, as well as anything else they have on there, by using promo code BITTER10 for 10% off. They're also available at REI. I will give one quick plug, although it's not winter or cooler. A couple other items that I have in my rotation when it does get cooler is the Repeat Merino long sleeve, the Rover Merino hoodie, the Trail Tights, and the Atlas multi-pant. I've been using Element electrolytes for quite some time now. Actually, a while back, I had a sweat test, and it suggested that I lose 614 milligrams of sodium per liter of fluid loss, meaning if I go out for a run and I sweat to the capacity where I lose a liter of fluid, I'm going to lose 614 milligrams of sodium along with that. So during these hot summer months, it's not uncommon that I will lose over a liter per hour when working out. So I favor adding some electrolytes to my workout fluids and pre-workout drinks in order to account for this. I also find it beneficial if I spend some time in the sauna and lose fluids fast that way. I currently have 3 approaches to using Element products. First is one of their warm beverage options in the morning with my coffee. Sometimes I'll put about half a pack of Element in there. Again, one of their warm beverage options. So usually that's something like chocolate mint, chocolate chai, chocolate raspberry, one of those. A second option is one of their fruity flavors in my water bottles while I'm training. So if I'm out there and I'm going through 16 to 20 ounce bottles of water, I'm going to sprinkle in some of that fruity Element flavors into that in order to account for that 614 milligrams of sodium that I'm going to lose. Third is their newest option, which is their Sparkle product, which is just a 16-ounce carbonated can with the Element electrolyte powder in it already mixed for you. So I've been using these for long runs and before afternoon training sessions in the gym when I know my fluid loss has been high. So I've been doing a lot of long runs lately, and having a can of Sparkle there to kind of sip at in between pit stops in the heat to cool down and rehydrate have been a great new addition to my training lineup. Just a reminder, their core flavors include citrus, watermelon, orange, grapefruit, raspberry, chocolate, mango chili, and chocolate caramel. Some seasonal options include chocolate mint, chocolate chai, and chocolate raspberry. You can go to drinklmnt.com/HPO. Throw in that /HPO and you'll get prompted for a free sample pack with your purchase and help support the Human Performance Outliers podcast along the way. The reason I chose Delta G over other exogenous ketone supplements is they have the formula and the dosage that is supported by the research we have to date. They have the DARPA grant to design for special forces, 50-plus research studies, and 20-plus ongoing studies. They also have approximately 3 times the amount of ketones in their product than many of their competitors do, which can be critical for hitting the ketone target ranges that suggest potential cognitive and performance benefits. I've been playing around with my protocol a bit during this last training block, so it has changed a bit from what prior protocols you may have heard me mention on here. For like longer training sessions, these are going to be the key points that I'm going to do it. So it's going to be lower intensity but long in duration. I like the long runs. I like these for long runs and even ultra-specific long runs, which tend to span beyond, say, 3 hours. And the way I will do this is I will take a bottle of Delta G Performance, that's the blue bottle they have on their website, about an hour into that training session. And then if that session goes beyond 3 hours, I will take a second one. If it doesn't, I will still take a second one post long run as a way to kind of kickstart things for whatever's coming up next. If you're interested in hearing more about it, I did record an episode with Brian McMahon. It's episode 351, Exogenous Ketones and Performance. And if you're also interested in checking more out about the product and signing up for a free consultation to find out how it would maybe fit your lifestyle, you can head to deltagketones.com. Feel free to throw in a promo code BITTER20 for 20% off your purchase of delta G ketones. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.